Move on. So first off, hello, welcome. My name is Gavin Reddick. I'm the Chief Analyst here at Researchfish, and today we're going to go through the 2026 Q1 mid-submission period webinar. So the first quarter of the year is a time when a lot of different funders have submission periods. And because of this, we keep a particular eye on this, although at any point in time, there can be, well, certainly there are never fewer than about 15 different funders that have at least one active submission period running at any one point in time. But today we're focusing on Q1. And I'm going to walk you through a few of the different stats relating to what we call user activation, which is first time log on this year, attribution, which is users going through and reporting particular outputs to particular awards, and finally submission. So if you do have any questions throughout, please drop them in the Q&A. And we'll have some time for discussion at the end as well. But if you do have a question on a particular slide, it's easier to raise it as we go rather than wait to the end because there are quite a few slides. So with that, I will get started. And as I said, the first thing we're going to look at is what we call user activation. So this looks at when the user logs on to Researchfish for the first time in this calendar year. Now, the calendar year is slightly different, and the main submission periods are different year on year. And so what we do is we apply a time shifting technique to match the core submission period from one year to the next. And so the equivalent date might have been, for example, a Monday last year or a Tuesday this year. And what we do is we shift them so that the days of the week essentially line up throughout. Because as you'll see, there's a lot of relationship between the days of the week and activities people are doing. Okay, so I'll take it a little bit slower at the very beginning just to give you a sense, and then we can speed up a little bit as we go through. So when we look at the annual user activation day by day, again, applying this time-shifted methodology, you can see here we've got the last 5 years plus this year. And if we look for that first year in 2021, what you can see there is a few different things. So you can see there is activity going on in January. This is relating primarily to the Nordic submission periods. You can see a very pronounced spike over this week, which is essentially the last week of the UK multi-funder submission period. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of first-time logins going there. And you can see very clearly which days are Saturday and Sunday, so in between there. And so that's what it looked like in 2021. If we go in and add 2022 on top of that using this time shifting methodology, what you can see is that the activity during the weekends are fairly constant, and you can see different spikes at different points of weeks year on year. And part of the reason for this are often different communications that go out. So as comms go out, researchers typically respond. So you can see the start of the submission period here has this initial peak, and then during the second week of the submission period, it's a bit lower. In the third week, you can see in this year, there was a key communication that went out to lots of people, and that went up. And you can see in the year before, that main contact didn't go out until the next week, which has a spike there, and it's in fact a bit lower for the next year. So you can see across each of the different submission periods over the last 5 years, a great degree of similarity with some noisiness based around these different comms spikes on particular days. If we layer on top this year, you can see a few different things. You can see there's a more first-time activation occurring in later January than previously. And you can see that while it's typically tracked the other years, last week it was noticeably lower. this week it's actually not that bad in comparison, so it's a bit more middling. And again, this typically relates to comms going out. Now, I appreciate it's a bit difficult to see exactly what's going on there. And so what we do is we do a maximum and minimum point, which is essentially the gray shaded area. And then you can see this blue line, which is this year. And so you can see it's been above or at maximum points sometimes, and it's been below or tracking sort of minimum points at other times, and then a little bit above this week so far. If we look just at the last 2 years, we look to try and see what the difference is between the equivalent day last year and this year. And so this graph here represents each daily difference. And if it's a positive, it'll be blue. So it was an increase more this year than last year. If it was a negative, it will be orange and it'll be fewer than last year. And then we cascade all of these day differences together, which gives you a sense as to the overall impact and how things are changing over time. And so you can see in this chart that we started the year a little bit lower. This is primarily during the Nordic submission periods. Then we had those spike increases towards the end, which brought the user activations by the time we get to the end of January pretty high. But then you can see the very last part of January actually lower day-on-day submission rates. And so this is to do with a few changes in how the Nordic submission periods are run. And so from the UK context, we start the year actually a bit down because of that already. And then you can see across the first 3 weeks, the pattern has been fewer activations each day pretty much. And then this week actually higher than relative rates last year, but still considerably down. So this is about 800 fewer user activations in the UK context at this point in time relative to last year. Now, that will ultimately have an effect on the next parts of the activity, which is the attributions and the submissions. But what we saw with some of the earlier figures is that actually you get a lot of people log in for the first time during the last week. And so that part of the challenge is that if this happens, there's just more intense activity during that period. Often it's nicer to shift some of that first time activity sooner, which keeps things a little bit calmer. But that's sort of the picture as it currently looks. To fully contextualize it, we can see what this means on a cumulative basis. And so you can see here again, the sort of the purple line, which has been across the lines at different points in times, but is now lower. And so currently, the year-on-year difference is about 1,400, as we were saying before, overall. But you can see here, we're at about 17,000 logins in total. So it's not an insignificant number to be down, but actually there is quite a lot of activity already. And as you can see, we would expect another 20,000 or so first-time logins over the next 2.5 weeks or so. And so there's a lot of activity that we are anticipating based on previous trends. And you can see where we fall in terms of the maximum and minimum points. Currently, we're here. So that's everything for user activation. Are there any questions or any comments on the data at this point? Is that hopefully clear to people? Okay, I'll move on. We can always come back if anything does occur. Brilliant, glad to hear. So now we look at the output attribution. So after a person logs on for the first time, the next thing they need to do to report, not necessarily because they could just confirm, but typically is attributing outcomes to their awards. And so the output attribution analysis that we're going to look at now looks at the date these outputs were attributed in Researchfish. Again, we apply the time shifting methodology to make sure we're as close as apples to apples as possible. And you can see here a few different features. So this is the equivalent to the first graph we looked at for the user activation. And so you can see yes, you can still see the weekends, but what you should be able to notice is there's a lot more variability year on year. And there's just a lot more sort of noise going on. And again, this typically relates to particular comms that have gone out. This also can relate to specific sets of harvesting activity we might have running. Some of these very big spikes relate to that. Um, and if we look to maximum and minimum, again, you can see across the attributions, mostly it's been on the lower end of things. Now, this year is a little bit different in that we've introduced a number of measures to try and help funders indicate to researchers what types of outputs to report and what to not report. And so our base expectation this year is we'll have fewer attributions than in previous years because funders are trying to signal, don't tell us about these kinds of things in a more sophisticated way than previously. And so if we look not at the maximum and minimum, but sort of the cumulative impact, so looking at the year-on-year, day-on-day difference, what you can see is a fairly consistent pattern of fewer attributions on each of the days. So you can still see some days that are higher. That corresponds with some harvesting we did on that date. And then ultimately we are quite a bit lower. So currently we are sitting at about 45,000 fewer attributions than at this point last year. Now, again, this is part of what funders are trying to achieve by having researchers not spend their time on things that perhaps aren't as important in terms of the reporting requirements for that particular award. And so when we look at this, we can see a few different things as to what's driving some of these numbers. So what types of outcomes are actually being reported to a lesser extent than in previous years. So the surprising biggest source of this so far are publications. So publications, not many people that I'm aware have indicated that this is a lower priority outcome, though some may have done so, and so there could be some response there. What we are seeing are fewer publications coming through from the harvesting routes relative to last year. And so this could be from a number of factors. It could be that we had some one-off benefits from harvesting new sources last year, which gave us a bit of catch up from previous years that maybe hadn't been reported. There might have been some changes in behavior among some of the sources in terms of the data that they put out. And there might be some changes that are impacting some of the harvesting. Certainly, we know there are a lot fewer people who've logged on so far, and so we would expect things to be generally lower because there are fewer people who have been on the system and doing things. So it could also be that this would reverse to an extent once people start logging on for the first time and reporting. Because if a publication has been brought in via, for example, the orchid harvesting, that's a person-based piece, so it's present in the researcher's portfolio, but it might not have an association to a particular award until they add it. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens to the publication numbers over time. The second biggest is not surprising, and so these are dissemination activities or engagements. So you can see here, relative to this point last year, we're almost at 13,000 fewer new attributions than previously. And this section was one of the main sections that funders have indicated that is of lower priority for researchers in terms of where they spend their time reporting. And so this is quite positive that researchers seem to be responding to it and refocusing their time elsewhere. The next biggest is personal outcome and recognition. So this is another area where a number of funders have indicated that this is a lower priority area. And so you can see there that's generally been down over as well. So the interpretation in this year is going to be a little bit tricky because we're actively encouraging people not to report, and we've got fewer people who have been active so far. But so far, I think things look quite positive in terms of the attributions. When we look at the cumulative story, you can see that there's a lot of commonality year on year. The blue year here in 2024, we had a lot of harvesting. There was a lot of activity going on that year that drove those numbers up. So there's a lot of new sources that were pulled in that particular year. You can see that overall we're a little bit down, and so the year-on-year difference is about 46,000. So who knows where we'll end up towards the end, but there's a lot of activity that we might expect over the next few weeks. So probably somewhere in the region of as much activity in the next, or twice as much activity in the next few weeks as we had in the previous part of the year. So a lot of concentrated activity. You can see these quite steep curves. Again, when we look at the maximum and minimum over the last several years, you can see that we're not the minimum year in terms of outputs being attributed there. But you can see there's a fair bit of variation, but there's a definite trend in activity over that time. When we look at when things are reported, so you can see in each of the quarters of the year, you can see that the Q1 activity period is distinct and is much larger than the other quarters across time. And you can see the sources of the different outputs. So dark blue being fully harvested, orange being uploaded by a research organization, dark green being the personal harvest, so like the orchid I was just talking about, blue being search, where the researchers went in and created the output as a result of one of the searches. So they might have used Crossref or some other search that's added all the information. Purple is when they've created an output using a search that's added the bulk of the information, but there might be some additional information that's required. And then green being where it's fully manual. What you can see is that in Q4 last year, the number of outputs reported was lower than the past few years, and the harvesting was relatively lower than the past few years, particularly 2024, which benefited from a lot of new sources that were coming in at that point in time. And you can see where we are currently in Q1. Obviously, we've got a fair way to go, and that will reasonably be expected to rise, somewhere around here, perhaps. And so we'll have to see where we get to. What this meant for 2025 was that the importance of Q2 through Q4 dipped a little bit. So you can see in this period, a lot of activity was going on, the bulk of it going on in Q1. In 2024, actually a quarter of the activity occurred outside of Q1. And then last year, it was only about 16%, driven in part by the lower harvesting. This is the current 12-month attributions by source. This is a little bit apples and oranges in that obviously we're not at the end of Q1 yet. So we'd expect this to grow in terms of absolute numbers. And you can see the percentage favors a little bit more on the manual side of things or the user entering, and a little bit less on the harvesting. So we'll have to see how that trend shapes up over time. This is just another way of visualizing that data. So you can see that currently, for example, though this will change in the quarter, the orange, which comes from the RO upload, is a greater proportionate amount of data that's reported. So there's more data that's reported, and it's a bigger percentage of the data reported this year relative to other years. And then just to summarize where we are for some of the different outputs, again, the other years compare the end of Q1 with where we are today in the 2026. But this should give you a sense as to, in previous years, how many of these things were reported in Q1. And so you can see on the publication side of things, we would expect maybe the 100,000 plus publications to be reported by the end of the quarter. Of the next most numerous output types, this touches on awards and recognition and dissemination to non-academic audiences. So those are the two types we mentioned, where a lot of funders are trying to encourage researchers not to report. And so you can see those are relatively down. You can see compared to each other, the dissemination is a lower proportion of where it would otherwise get to year on year compared to things like collaborations and further funding, although that might change as people report more. So you can see there are fewer absolutes, but also the ratio between where we are now this year compared to the end of last year is starker for the next dissemination activities. And then for the other outputs, you can see there's a lot more variability. The absolute numbers are fewer. You can see there's a particular harvesting spike in this year. But generally speaking, those are ticking along, and there aren't so many people who've downplayed some of those. So we'll have to see where we get to. Possible exception of facilities where thinking a number of funders have said this isn't a priority area. Okay, so before we leave the attribution side of things, are there any questions, any comments, anything everyone wants to raise? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the submissions. So again, the submissions looks at the date an award was submitted in Researchfish. So all of the activity here is based on this. We use the same time shifting methodology. And it's worth saying as part of this, a particular award can submit as part of a submission period, and then it can resubmit as a part of the same submission period. So an award might submit yesterday and then resubmit today. So in this case, we would today count the submission today only. So it wouldn't count twice, it would only count once, and it's only going to count for the most recent submission period. So when we look year on year and look week on week, we can see some shifting of things that had submitted, let's say a week ago, might resubmit next week. And so some of the figures might shift a little bit over time, but just to bear that in mind. When we look at this same graph on the number of submissions on any individual day, we can see that same pattern that goes throughout. You can see the weekend very strongly. You can see different spikes driven by different sets of comms going out across the different years. And you can see that actually there's a lot of activity that occurs on the last week of the UK multi-funder submission period. So a lot of people submit during that last week. And you can see from where we are now, typically there's a lot more activity that builds up next week as well. Again, if we zoom in, so we just compare against the maximum and minimum points, you can see that some of the time we've been higher on individual days. And actually the start of the UK submission period here is pretty consistent behavior across all of these different graph types. And then we've tracked a little bit lower on the lower end of things, sometimes higher. But this is where we are now as to one of the points where typically there's a big upswing. So we'll have to see we're at the precipice. If we look at individual day differences, so you can see a few things here. You can see some more variation in the Nordic submission periods. And you can see a little bit of that behavior that we mentioned, that compared to previous years, by the time the UK multi-funder submission period started, we were a couple of hundred submissions down relative to that point in previous years. And then you can see in terms of the submissions this year, we've got some oranges, which again are negative numbers, but you can also see a number of blues. And so relative to where we started the submission period, we're more or less on track compared to last year from a UK context. So there's very little difference in the number of awards that have been submitted so far across all funders in Researchfish. And you can see this in the cumulative awards submitted by day. And so you can see here the cumulative graph. Year on year, it's minus 231. But again, we started from the UK context about 200 down versus previous years. So we've increased and made up that, or started to make up some of that, and we're about 30 down versus last year. And that's 30 down out of about 11,000 submissions so far. So it's tracking very closely on submissions, which is interesting considering we have a very big difference in the number of people who've been active on the site. So there are a lot of people who would otherwise be active already, but that hasn't filtered through to a change in the submission behavior. Often people submit quite closely to the point at which they first become active. But maybe this year we'll see a little bit of a bigger difference in that behavior this year. So again, so one option we could do is to do the whole presentation again, but I think instead we'll just pick up where we left off. So again, we're looking at the cumulative year-on-year difference, time shifted. You can see that we're tracking pretty closely, but there's a lot of submission activity that typically happens. So we're just at the point where we see this very sharp increase, or at least we have in previous years. So this is always the point at which we wonder, will this happen this year, or will there be a difference? You can see the behavior overall has been quite consistent. You can see we're below the maximum, the highest year that we've had, but actually we're comfortably above the minimum as well in terms of the numbers at this point in time. And this doesn't relate to the researcher's activity, but this is just a sort of a reassurance point here about the time taken to process submission. So when a user clicks submit, there is a period of time where they're locked out of their account while we process the submission. And this just lets you know how long it typically takes. And so you can see here in this blue color, these are the instances where that process took between 0 and 30 seconds. So you can see currently in 2026 so far, 56% of all submissions have been processed in 30 seconds or less. So that's the lockout time. And then another 40% between 31 seconds and 60. So we're currently at 96% of submissions processed within a minute. And then you can see a small number above. It can get very busy towards the very end of the submission period, which is when you end up taking a little bit longer. But generally speaking, there are high levels of performance, making sure that the submissions don't take too long to process. And then finally, in terms of submissions, we can look at the different response codes and just see a snapshot of where we are today. And so here you can see all the response code ones that are currently in submission. You can see the year that those awards started. And then the different colors indicate the different points those awards are at. And so the green bars are the absolute number of awards with a response code that have been submitted. So you can see here in 2021, a little over 1,000 response code 1 awards have submitted. The blue bar indicates the number of awards where the awards have not yet been submitted, so they're not green, but the user is active on Researchfish, the PI. And so you can see the blue, actually quite a lot of these are active already. Then you can see the yellow. The yellow is where the researcher, the PI, has accepted the invitation, but they have not been active this year yet. And so you can see the yellows are a bit higher, relatively speaking, in the more recent years. These are not first-time reportees, but they are more recent. And you can see the red, the number that have not accepted an award invitation yet, and they're otherwise response code 1. We always see this highest for the most recent year because these are typically the first time they're being asked to report. and they just haven't reported yet. And you can see across the different cohorts, with the exception of the most recent years, again, there can be just some first-time behavior involved, there's reasonably consistent levels of submission independent of when those awards started. So the rates are very similar. And you can see in terms of activation, a similar kind of pattern, so quite high, quite consistent across most of the cohorts, lower for the more recent cohorts, which again is expected. And then the exceptions is a little bit lower there. So response code 1, those are mandatory submission expected. And then the response code 4s. So this is the same as response code 1, but the researcher has moved institutions, and so the ability to communicate with them isn't as great. So it typically follows a similar pattern internally, but with lower absolute levels. So again, these are researchers who are more difficult to get in contact with. And then finally, before moving on from this submissions as a whole, what we've also observed is that some funders, in particular, some of the larger funders, have had some communications issues in terms of sending emails out to institutions and researchers, and this may be having an impact on the number of people who've been active for them and potentially from other funders as well. Across all funders, it's pretty even. So about half of the funders this year have lower submissions than at this point in previous years, and about half of them have higher submission periods, higher submission rates compared to this point in previous years. So overall, as you can see, we're tracking very closely, but we are aware that for some funders, the gap is bigger, and this may be explainable in part through some of these communication issues that we're seeing. So that may well change over the future. And then finally, I should say, are there any questions, any comments on the submission side of things before we move on? Okay. Then finally, just to say, there are 2 more webinars planned later in March. So the post-UK multi-funder submission period webinar that goes through the activity and basically through to almost the end of Q1. And then also one focus more around exporting data and using the data, and that's on the afternoon of the same day. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. And does anybody have any questions or any comments? Okay. If there are no questions, then thank you very much. You're welcome. If there are no questions, then I think we'll draw it to a close for today. Thank you very much for attending, and we'll ensure that we'll all keep a close eye on the activity over the next few weeks. Thank you very much. Goodbye. You can resume.